Hello, it's me again from Istanbul. Hoping you're staying safe and staying at home and doing the best you can under the circumstances in which we live these days. And of course, we continue to keep folks in our prayers. Still, the people in Halifax and those people who lost their lives on the helicopter crash, and so many others that are struggling with lockdown and loss of family and friends. And so we keep all those folks in our prayers. Our preaching point today is comes out of Acts, and it's Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 47. So if you want to take a look at that first and put me on pause, go right ahead. And this week we shouldn't tell Mr. Trump that there's communism in the Bible, or at least very close socialism. The passage is about, holding all things in common and sharing what we have, a great Christian value, but as we are all human, it's not always shown. In the United Church Gathering uh, this week, it suggests to ponder, to think about sharing your home, let's say, with someone from the congregation. Well, I've always felt that all God's children are sort of part of the congregation. And years ago, after my mom passed away, I turned the big house in Danville, my house, into a halfway house. And so I did share the house with characters, many characters. I had one person who was there for 6 months under house arrest, and I met up with my dear son, Junior, who at the time, while his girlfriend was pregnant, he was having his first child. I hope his only child. Anyway, and he was in Talbot in the prison in Sherbrooke. And so it was a tough time for him, a tough time for me. And don't worry about privacy. He'll tell you these things almost the moment you meet him, one of his problems. But anyway, we see in the passage that the disciples move from being called disciples to apostles. The idea, of course, of discipleship is to learn from Jesus. And of course, after Jesus is resurrected, the apostles, which means messenger, become the messengers of good news. So, part of my journey with turning the big house, well, frankly, if you want the truth, I was bored and alone, and I wanted something to do. And I had a lot of help from my friend Lou and John. But at the same time, it was an incredible experience. We used to have 10 or 11 people around the dining room table every night. And the one house rule was to get around that dining room table and to talk about our day. And people would talk about their journey. And we had people that were immigrants, and as I said, people under house arrest, people who had alcohol and drug problems, and, Junior, who at the time was in prison. Anyway, that was that journey. The irony of all things is 20 years later, after learning from these incredible characters in my home, the big house, burnt to the ground. And what happened after that? Well, I sat in an ambulance at the Legion across the street, and I watched the house burn down with all of its memories and all of its stuff. And again, it was another journey, another learning experience. It helps to know that you have a community that shares all in your relationship with God. And my small church communities have always been that to me. And even though I struggled and had trouble with coughing and all sorts of other aftermath effects, and I wasn't even there, my community in Danville held a benefit for me and raised money to help me. Sharing in community, sharing life in common. Sharing my home with others was kind of a breeze in a way. It was an incredible learning experience. I learned a lot about mental health. I learned a lot about addiction. And I learned a lot about people. It helped me as a minister on my journey. I learned and got as much as I ever gave. And then, in the end, when the house burnt down, I learned how to receive as well as to give. These are things that happened in the early church, in the church of Luke that was accepting Gentiles, being inclusive and open, sitting around the table and sharing communion. These are things that we can learn from the early church. They are things that we can learn in our daily lives. And during this pandemic, these are things that we can learn each and every day. I've been so proud of the community at the Wales Home, of the way they have held things in common, virtually, keeping the residents safe and keeping our community open and free, so that we can communicate virtually, so that they can show church services on their TV channel. And they're constantly sending me messages from the residents and showing how well they are doing. We too can share our lives in common, and we are messengers of the good news. So, may you be the hands and feet of Christ in a troubled world, and may you know God's blessing and God's wonder at all we can be as disciples and messengers of Christ's church. Amen.